on half frame at the moment.
Hi there, Keith. How are you?
Hi, Jason. I'm all right, thank you.
Good man. Another beautiful sunny day.
Yep.
Right, today in the parlour, talking about propaganda. So if we kick off with a definition of propaganda, and then we can run it from there. So propaganda is communication that is used primarily to influence an audience and further an agenda, which may not be objective and may be presenting facts selectively to encourage particular synthesis or perception, or using loaded language to produce an emotional rather than a rational response to the information. So a lot to go there, but succinctly, effectively, it's just about mind control and for getting us to respond through the emotional part of our brain, our minds, instead of the rational, logical part of our brains or minds. But at the same time, of course, remembering that we are all guilty of it and we are all likely to participate in it. However, I think what we need to look at today is the way in which power, people in elite, powerful, authoritative groups use that propaganda in order to restrict our free will, in order to restrict our capacity to make rational decisions based upon fact.
Yeah.
Is that cool?
Yeah. Yeah.
So any examples that you can think of at all in relation to how power is using propaganda to manipulate us?
I think the thing that springs to mind in recent time is Tom Moore, who did something amazing, and he raised £30 million, and how quickly he was overtaken by the state. So he was rewarded with I think a knighthood, a colonel, and what that did effectively in our minds was okayed the NHS as a charity instead of something we all contribute to as a state organisation, and endorsed by the state. It did something exactly what Matt Hancock wanted, which was to it really undermined the NHS. What they did, not what Tom Moore did. What he did was amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I entirely agree with you, and I fully accept that Tom Moore. I mean, I'm not into SIRS or MBEs and CBEs. I'm just not into that at all. So if Tom doesn't mind, I'll just refer to him as plain old Tom. But in essence, you know, what he did at 100 years old was to do a long distance walk in his garden, like you said, to raise money for the NHS. What that also enabled the state to do, the government to do, was to distract us from the fact that so many people were suffering and so many carers, healthcare professionals were suffering because of the government's incompetence, because of their lies, which we've now seen, you know, it's now officially identified that they have lied since even before the pandemic began. And of course, also you have the clap for every Thursday.
Yes.
I mean, initially, I think that there was definitely a positive outcome for people in hospitals, especially in those areas where the pandemic was at its worst, to know that the public were behind them. They were physically, actively behind them, and it was, you know, across social media, etc. I think the problem started for the clap for was when the clap for Boris thing came in, because it was politicised.
Yes.
And for a lot of people who either didn't believe that Boris was as ill as he said, in some cases they didn't believe he was ill at all. But ultimately what you had then was, instead of the NHS being the focus of the attention, or the care workers in whatever capacity they were at, you had the Prime Minister. And remembering at the last general election, the Prime Minister only actually got 43% of the country to vote for him, who turned out at the ballot box. 57% voted elsewhere. So it was always going to be undermining, I think, the clap for experience. What about going back a bit in terms of propaganda, some of the more profound characters like Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays? What are your feelings about him?
I think he's one of the most loathsome creatures that's ever existed in humanity. He was kind of the father of capitalism,
Materialism.
advertising.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Materialism.
And he took what in war time was called propaganda. He created public relations. And that was entirely about manipulating and subduing the public, because he carried on with Freud's idea that there was a wild, untamed part of humanity that must be subdued. And what Edward Bernays did was began the erosion of choice.
Yes, so that now when you walk along the aisle in the supermarket, what you get is a whole load of products that have been determined for you elsewhere. And so therefore, for example, let's say that, the local supermarket has 8 brands of tea. Well, we know that there's probably 800 or 8,000 brands of tea, but they've chosen those particular brands for us.
Yeah.
And what we don't get is the explanation as to why. The lobbying that goes on, for example, by certain companies, the backhanders or the favours that are handed out, again, by certain very, very wealthy companies that lead supermarkets to pick a product over another. So what Bernays has effectively enabled the West to do is to pummel us with advertising to get us to buy the products of, at the end of the day, let's not debate this, it's very, very large corporations. It's not, or very rarely, I should say, very rarely is it local producers. And until propaganda then is becomes this nasty thing, because ultimately it means that the communities disintegrate, local businesses disintegrate, and we all just buy something that's based in some low tax threshold part of the planet.
Yeah. And in fact, his first act, the first thing he did was the cigarette companies wanted women to start smoking. So he created these torches of freedom.
Yes. In
the New York Parade, I believe. An extraordinary. I mean, he was an incredibly talented man, just perverted. Well, that's my opinion.
Yeah. So far we've looked at the nature of propaganda used by, obviously, government in the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, and we've looked at one of the fathers, if you like, of materialism in the way in which propaganda was used to sucker us into buying stuff, let's face it, we didn't really want.
Yep.
Probably just as pervasive is the way in which, when we actually do get our stab at participating in what is loosely called a democracy, we also find that propaganda plays extremely crucial role there too. If I can just read out this paragraph by George Monbiot, which he wrote in an article in 2019. And he says, The rewards for political lying are massive. They include winning referendums and elections. The penalties are either non-existent or tiny. If the Conservative Party is sanctioned by the Electoral Commission for any of its outrageous lying and cheating, it might, long after the election, have to pay the maximum of £20,000, which is, for a friendly billionaire, who would doubtless pull this out of his back pocket.
Mm.
So they don't care about the fines, they don't care about the punishments, because ultimately winning power brings far greater rewards.
Yep.
And for me, that effectively says we don't live in a democracy. We live in possibly a plutocracy, we possibly live in an oligarchy, but we do not live in a democracy. Democracy means more than, one, being able to vote every 5 years, but two, when you do vote, not being given the accurate information to allow us to make a rational choice.
Yeah.
So ultimately, we've given 3 examples here, but where do you think we can improve, Keith, the system, the process by which propaganda can become limited, because we're never going to eradicate it, but become much more limited, and therefore democracy can be allowed to actually be real and flourish?
I think we had a chat earlier, and it's forcing them to be accountable for their actions.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, and I think, you know, what we need is independence, don't we? We need people who are truly independent, truly skilled up, academics, lawyers, lay people, but we need people who are able to take those who lie to us to task. And I think, as George Monbiot points out in this article, we actually do have it to some degree in our legislation already. It's just that the punishments don't fit the crime. And my personal idea, obviously, just to offer a solution, which people can discuss as they wish, is to set up independent group of people that they go through the published press daily. They identify where there are issues in relation to the, shall we say, the validity of the information, the validity of what's being printed and spoken. And they are able to do something about it. So what they do is they go through, for example, the Daily Mail. They identify, let's say, for example, 5 articles which they argue do not fulfill the remit that we would expect within a democracy. In other words, they're propagandized.
Yep.
They're then able to pass that on to a smaller group who, along with lawyers, are able to go through those articles systematically. And if they still agree, for example, that all 5 or only 3 of those articles contravene, they are then able to contact the paper, the editor, and their legal team, and they are able to say to them, you have contravened, and you have 7 days to get back to us and appeal our decision. If they do appeal, then we need to have an independent arbitration service that is entirely independent and entirely focused just on media propaganda, which then, what they are able to do is to set those sanctions. So you go to the arbitrator, let's say the Daily Mail, go to the arbitrator sits down over however long it takes and decides that 3 of those articles definitely contravene. So what then the Mail has to do, the same size as the original article, on the same page, it has to publish an apology and it has to publish the conclusions by the arbitrator. It then allows their reader, when they're coming through page 7, to see same size, same type text, etc., that the Mail lied to them. If they then contravene again, and again the arbitrator finds that they have contravened, then they should have the ability to publish suspended, I'd say, for 24 hours.
Mhm.
And so it goes on. So eventually you could end up in a situation where the advertisers at the Daily Mail are thinking it's simply not worth giving them any money anymore. It's simply not worth advertising with this paper because they're constantly lying. They're constantly being found to be lying, and they're constantly having their publication suspended or having to publicly apologise. How does that sound?
It sounds excellent to me, because if you just impose a fine, well, these publications are owned by billionaires. A fine means nothing to them. But if you take away the platform, they're going to squeak. That's going to hurt them.
Yes.
And I think you're right. That's the most effective way to deal with it, I think.
And I think also having a website where you can go on anytime and look at the league table, all the papers, all the broadcasters, whatever, in a league table, you click on it and it tells you how many contraventions they have, what the punishments be, what the arbitrator has concluded. And you can make your own decision then as you actually ever want to buy that paper or watch that TV news or whatever it might be again. Because then the public are being informed and they can make rational choices.
And we're getting back towards a democracy.
And we're getting back towards a democracy, which is effectively what we're told we live in. But as we've said earlier, it seems to be quite a distance away. And I know, that people will say, oh, look at North Korea. Look at China. We're a lot better than them. But being better than China or North Korea shouldn't be the benchmark. Being perfect, or at least aiming for perfection, even if we fall short, should be our raison d'etre. Because then we can be proud of ourselves. We can be proud of the fact that we've lived our life and it hasn't been a lie.
Right. Yeah. And we're empowered.
And we're empowered.
The heart of a democracy is an empowered public.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think our time is up, Keith, again for another day. Great to chat. And we'll be back on soon to discuss something else that hopefully captures the public imagination.
Brilliant.
See you soon.
Thanks, mate.